I love the United States. I love the United States intellectual tradition. I love and cherish all the threads that go into that. And Columbia, specifically with its Jewish American underpinnings, is like a part of that. I've worked with this institution to bring about positive free speech results, and to see the alumni and the administrators of this university just bend the knee to Donald effing Trump on this it's heartbreaking.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Marie, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morse. How are you this time?
Not bad, not bad. How you doing, Rory?
I'm doing well. I just think maybe we should have a nice, easy episode, and I thought we'd focus maybe
Sure.
on Canada and maybe Mark Carney, a Mark Carney special. What do you think? That can't be that
Sure.
controversial.
That
What-
sounds great,
what have-
right? Nice.
What have you got in mind?
Yeah, well, I was thinking we'd go a little harder, Rory.
Okay.
I would like to talk about Israel and free speech in the United States.
Okay. That won't be
Yeah.
controversial.
No, not at all. I think it's important to say at the outset that this is something I find particularly appalling, and unlike almost everything we discuss, I consider it a personal attack. So I hope all a personal attack on me and my rights as an American citizen. I hope that I'll be able to retain a certain level of balance as I discuss this. I think I can sometimes stay calm and even flippant when I'm discussing the oppressions of other countries. So perhaps I should be able to do the same with oppression in
Mhm.
mine. But I think it is an undeniable statement that Israel, the country, and its supporters are the greatest threat to free speech in the United States than we have seen since Joe McCarthy of the 1950s. And I would argue in a lot of ways it's kind of worse than that.
Okay.
Because at least with Joe McCarthy, there was a perception of a real threat. And there were actually some people who did have affiliations with the Soviet Union.
Oh, yeah. Useful idiots, isn't that the term often bandied about?
That is certainly a term that is bandied about. But like McCarthyism, the fact is that in the 1930s in the United States, you had most of the intellectuals in this country were whole hog for the Soviet Union and thought they were great. By the 1940s and 1950s, when McCarthy had his heyday, the early 1950s, I think that phenomenon had largely died out. But there were actual Soviet spies. There were actual.
Oh, yeah. There was reasoning behind
There
it.
was some rationale there. What this current threat against U.S. free speech is about is exclusively protecting genocide, and that's hard to come up with any kind of justification for.
Mhm.
I guess I have friends. I have friends with young children who do feel threatened by the amount of time that students and professors and, frankly, people like me feel like spending talking about genocide that a country, Israel, that they love is committing. And I want to be sensitive to that.
Mhm.
And I don't, want to force anybody to listen to my podcast or force anybody to face that. But generally speaking, my attitude towards people who want to arrest and throw people out of the country and make it illegal to speak the truth about a genocide, I have no sympathy and a great deal of anger for that.
So I think we're at a turning point where it felt almost like Trump had kind of de-escalated this the war with Palestine, when it seems very recently they've started bombing again, and Israel is now doing another ground invasion.
Yes, and it's quite. Has the ground invasion actually started? I've been researching other stuff this morning, but
It
yeah.
hasn't started yet, though. They said they're going to.
Yeah, so we're recording this on March 20th, so I have no doubt that more horrors will be revealed. Perhaps, Rory, Trump will have revealed himself to actually be, on the side of the good guys and say, hey, Israel, you can't do that anymore. A week of this is enough. But I find that incredibly hard to credit. I think it's very likely that he's going to. We had 2 months of ceasefire, I think, more or less, which was vastly more than genocide Joe Biden ever managed. But and I still have some hope that he'll renew it. But his actions specifically to coordinate with Israel's renewed assault, renewed genocide on Gaza, to coordinate both U.S. attacks on Yemen to protect that genocide, and to present a coordinated attack on U.S. campuses, free speech, and U.S. residents that are attempting to express themselves under the First Amendment, which is guaranteed in the United States. The timing of this is extraordinary. I mean, it is essentially a U.S. president looking at universities and students and free speech on universities as the same class of opponent as a foreign government that is bombing shipping. I have a lot of sympathy for what the Houthis are doing, but fundamentally that's a foreign government of, yes, religious fanatics that are in a shooting war with the U.S. Navy, and Trump is treating U.S. college students in the same way, by which I mean clearly, in retrospect, we know that Trump knew that Israel was about to go into Gaza, so he stepped up a bombing campaign against the Houthis so they couldn't fire any missiles at Israel. And he stepped up a campaign against U.S. universities, starting with Columbia, which was sort of the forefront of the protest movement in spring of 2024. At the same time, he essentially unleashed an onslaught on U.S. campuses in tandem with the Israeli government's choice to return to genocide. And that's really outrageous. That is
Has
quite shocking.
the clampdown on universities protesting against the conflict, has it escalated under Trump, or what ways it changed?
Interesting thing about campus protest in the United States is that it pretty much exclusively happens in these months. It is March and it's getting warmer.
Okay, the good months of the year when it's sunnier.
It's getting warmer. There are certainly many, many campuses in the west and south of this country that are always warm and sunny, but most of the more prestigious ones, most of the, and just the concentration of these institutions are where Americans have lived for centuries rather than, 5 decades like California and Texas in large numbers. So it's like a more northeasterly thing. So it has to be warm enough for students to want to sit outside and yell things. And this is an onslaught by the Trump administration, timed both with the genocide and to avert the big protest season. And we'll get to what he's doing to Columbia specifically, but this is part of a much broader story that actually predates October 7th. It certainly took a new malign turn during October 7th. And it's key to point out as we look at what this Trump administration onslaught on free speech is about. It's important to emphasize the continuity with what the Biden administration was putting up with and allowing to happen. The Biden administration was not going to be as outrageously, illegally, unconstitutionally against free speech as the Trump administration was, but it definitely not just allowed, but endorsed the laying of a lot of the groundwork for these actions. And but anyway, let's sort of take the story back a bit. Free speech in the United States is real important. It's obviously something that I cherish as someone who has a lot of not mainstream views on U.S. foreign policy and U.S. politics more generally. It is, but I'm not alone in that.
Mhm.
Free speech is something that is fetishized all over the U.S. political spectrum, far beyond the way that it is valued in Europe or any other developed country in the world. It is seen as fundamental. We have a Bill of Rights in the United States, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The first one, it does include freedom of religion, but it also includes freedom of speech. And this is really fundamental, to the point where Marco Rubio had this ridiculous set of statements where he's like, "Oh yes, we have impounded Mahmoud Khalil, essentially only can be described as a political prisoner." I wouldn't go as far as to say he is the first political prisoner in U.S. history, but he is certainly the most prominent of this era. He says, yeah, this guy didn't commit any crime. I think the official justification that he's is that he's bad for U.S. foreign policy or something along those lines. But yeah, he essentially said, yeah, he didn't commit a crime, but this isn't about free speech. We assure you it's not about free speech. Because, and quite loudly and fanatically, really, like free speech has been a rallying cry of the MAGA right.
Yeah.
It's probably, in the top 5 slogans of the base that put.
You don't think it was used as a sort of Trojan horse just so they could say extreme stuff, and now that they're in
Of course,
power,
well, of course.
everyone else gets turned off?
There are absolutely, I've been really impressed with an organization called FIRE, which is.
Foundation of Individual Rights and Expression.
Yes, exactly. But they are absolutely a right or right-wing oriented advocacy group that is most concerned about free speech for conservatives on campuses. But they have, as the oppression of left-wing speakers has really shot up under the Trump administration, pro-Palestine speakers over the course of Biden's genocide and the Trump administration, they've really been very consistent. So FIRE is a great organization. So they're amazing.
Mhm.
And there are other standout right-wing pundits who have spoken out about Mahmoud Khalil since his arrest on March 8th. But mostly it's pretty vacant. What's also quite extraordinary is that Columbia, the institution that is the focus of Donald Trump's ire, and actually was the focus of the ire of the Biden administration as well, actually has a storied history of free speech. Their last president, Lee Bollinger, who was briefly a president of the University of Michigan when he was much younger, sort of his stepping stone to being at Columbia, was famous as a free speech advocate. I think as part of the admissions materials to Columbia, they talk about their history of campus activism or what have you. And I worked with Columbia against the Biden administration to assert the rights of journalists to interview Hezbollah just over the past year. So that's what's especially disturbing about the humbling of this great institution, is that it's actually historically a place that cherishes free speech above all others. So I'm not just a pundit who likes to talk about free speech. I'm also still officially an attorney, though I haven't practiced in many years, and I went to law school. And the free speech is, these are at the heart of free speech issues. These iconic cases, Tinker and many others, are at the heart of how American attorneys and the judicial classes in the United States define themselves. So this onslaught, this Israel-based onslaught on free speech is really quite extraordinary. And again, to defend a genocide. The roots of this do go beyond what we're seeing this week, what we saw during the Biden administration. Specifically, I think it's tied to the right of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the history of which I probably should have looked into, but is something that has existed really only over the past decade or 2 decades or so. And specifically, what the Israel superfans were doing in the United States was going from sort of Republican state legislature to Republican state legislature, doing what they could to institute laws against the BDS movement. You got to start small with this sort of thing. When you're trying to assault one of the most cherished rights in U.S. history, you got to start small. You can't just, have a law against criticizing Israel. I mean, come on, that'd be crazy. You have to go small ball. And you have to talk about anti-Semitism, and you have to, I think the sort of form law that we saw in a lot of Republican legislatures, and I think it may have been passed in like half of U.S. states at this point, is that you can't do any business with the state government without signing some kind of pledge saying you won't participate in any boycott, divestment, or sanctions of Israel, which is insane.
Yeah, just Israel? So you can boycott other countries?
Of course, because boycotting is,
Oh, yeah.
what the Boston Tea Party is at the center of U.S.
Existence?
history. Yeah, is at the center of U.S. history, and the U.S. Revolution was the U.S. colonists' refusal to import British tea. Boycotts are as American as apple pie. And
How big was the South African boycott, if you can remember?
So I think there was a couple different aspects of that. I don't have details on that, but certainly in the 1980s there was.
But it wasn't made illegal.
No, No, it was not made illegal. That's a really interesting question, Rory, that I had not dived into. To what extent did people try to? Because I'm sure there was pushback on the sanctioning of South Africa, but that I think that actually gets to sort of the question of like why now exactly? Like
Hmm.
why now? Why over the past decade has Israel gone so nuts on trying to attack this fundamental U.S. right to speech? And interestingly, I was doing research this morning, and Texas has actually already overturned one of these attempts to limit the ability to boycott, because that, I mean, it is fundamental to American history, to American rights, to the U.S. Constitution, the right to have your own political views, to speak them and to exercise them through boycotts is fundamental. These laws are put in place on the understanding that they will almost certainly be declared unconstitutional when they move into the court system. There's the key thing that everything that IPAC, Israel Superfans, the Columbia alumni, the Trump administration, all of these fascists, all of their basic assumptions that they're working with is that the sort of the law works a lot faster than the judges. For a judge to throw out a law, you got to have somebody who wants to go through the process of suing against that
Yeah.
law. So what this is, I think, even the people, any competent lawyer who's working for one of these pro-Israel fascist organizations that are trying to limit U.S. speech knows that what they're doing is illegal and unconstitutional, but they also know that it'll take months,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
sometimes years, for the courts to catch up and throw this out, and they will have the chilling effect. That's actually like a legal term in First Amendment jurisprudence. They'll have the chilling effect that they want to have anyway. So yeah, Texas courts throw out this stuff. Courts all over the country throw out this stuff, but it's 2 or 3 years later, and the message is received that you better, if you want to do any business with a red state government and some blue state governments, you better not.
Hmm.
You better not talk at all about Palestine. And it is fundamentally against the fundamental DNA of the United
Has
States.
it affected New York much in the sense that I think their mayor is a bit compromised, is he not?
Compromised in what sense?
Was the mayor of New York not like facing a lot of corruption charges, and it looks like the Trump team has sort of bailed him out?
Yes, that's related to Turkey.
Yes.
But yeah, corruption is a standard. The New York experience with this kind of stuff is interesting because New York is absolutely, a blue state, Democratic or what have you, but it is also very strongly. There's a large Jewish population here, and there's certainly many pro-Palestine, anti-Zionist, or pro-peace Jewish people, but by and large, the more mainstream Jewish institutions, Jewish American institutions, are very pro-Israel. But New York is also run largely by competent lawyers, probably too many lawyers.
Mm.
And I do believe the New York. I looked into this not this morning, but some months ago, and New York attempted to put in some kind of legislation that's kind of on this level, but their lawyers are too good, and essentially it's functionally meaningless.
Okay.
So, like, I think the New York government looks with great disfavor on anybody but they can't actually codify that into any law or any like strong dictate that would make it unconstitutional, because New York lawyers. A lot of New York lawyers may really like Israel, but I think New York lawyers are loyal to the law first, and even if they want to.
They're professional.
Yeah, that's the term you're looking. That was the term I was looking for. Even very Zionist New York lawyers are professional enough
Hmm.
to know that this is nonsense, or at least they were before October 7th, and that's a key dynamic here, because part of the reason why Columbia is doing such a craven lickspittle performance around both the Biden and Trump administration's pressures around free speech is because a lot of their alumni want that. A lot of their alumni are susceptible to this idea that free speech around Israel and Palestine is somehow hurtful or anti-Semitic, which is, to me, nonsense. But we're jumping ahead of it here. So this has been a growing dynamic, but it's been kind of under the radar by design, really. It's any real attention to this issue before October 7th was just like, wait a second, like This is not something that IPAC wanted attention to. They just wanted to sort of quietly say, yeah, you just can't deal with BDS because it's so transparently, obviously anti-American and quite sinister. And it is an attack on every American and every American's most cherished right. So yeah, they're trying to being quiet about it. Since October 7th, this approach has gone into overdrive. Specifically, I think there is a legalistic, weird way, and this is specifically what Texas threw out earlier this year, of making it illegal to criticize Israel. And that is through a set of definitions put together by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is an interesting organization, seems generally does not seem malign. It'd be interesting to see what their current funding profile is, but actually seems to have been set up initially by a Swedish prime minister who thought that was really troubled by Holocaust denial in Sweden and wanted to make sure education around the Holocaust was more widely presented, which I have zero problem with. In fact, I think there's a great dispute as to how you teach the Holocaust. Is the Holocaust a terrible thing that should never happen again, that everybody should know about? I agree entirely. It's one of the most evil, most disgusting things that illustrates how all of humanity is vulnerable to the urge to commit these crimes and crimes like this, and we should constantly be vigilant against anyone who would want to commit these crimes. So Holocaust awareness, yes, everywhere. Holocaust denial, evil. Prosecutable in Germany? Hell yeah, you can't prosecute it in the United States for free speech, which is, a more important value to me. But absolutely, Holocaust awareness. Let's talk about it.
Oh yeah, but it makes total sense in Germany. Like I don't mind it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I don't mind criminalizing Holocaust denial in Germany. But if the lesson you're taking from the Holocaust is that Jews can commit more Holocausts,
Hmm.
that's not something. Yeah. So never again for anybody is the appropriate message. Never again to the Jews specifically, and the Israeli state can do anything that they judge. And that's the conflation here, and why these HRA definition of anti-Semitism is so pernicious is because they try to blur the line between Jewish and Israel. And I think that's about the most anti-Semitic thing you can
But
do.
also it's mostly just what Benjamin Netanyahu wants to do as well.
Well, yeah. But that's fundamental here. Is I think blurring the line between Jewish people and the state of Israel is about the most anti-Semitic thing you can do, because the state of Israel is fundamentally a genocidal apartheid state. Is that natural in its DNA? Does it have to be a genocidal apartheid state? Of course not. I think it is very possible. I still think it is very possible, despite all the evidence of the past 20 years, that there can be a Jewish state in Israel that is not a genocidal apartheid state. With Israel as a genocidal apartheid state, it is deeply, deeply anti-Semitic to blame every Jew for the actions of Israel. The AHRA has a set, and this is complicated and legalistic, which is why it's so useful for getting around the First Amendment for lawyers in the United States. The IHRA has a definition of anti-Semitism that is, I think, largely benign, is largely, yes, that's anti-Semitism, of course. However, in that definition of the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism, they include examples. And these pieces of legislation are all careful to say, including the examples, because in the examples, there are, I think it's 2 or 3 things that say something along the lines of, it is part of anti-Semitism. It is anti-Semitic to compare the actions of Israel to Nazi Germany. These are comparisons we have made and will continue to make, because what is Gaza if it's not the clearance of a ghetto? I can't remember the exact terminology, but there's another version of simply saying that essentially saying in these IHRA definitions, not in the definition, because that'd be crazy, but in one of the examples of anti-Semitic things you can do, is essentially saying that being anti-Zionist, being against, saying anything against the Israeli state is anti-Semitic. And and apparently one of the authors of this definition has said, that's not how I meant to use it.
Mhm.
Don't do that. But that is sort of the Trojan horse. That is the legalistic fiction through which we are attempting to criminalize any discussion of, and to be clear, anti-Semitism is not criminalized in the United States. anti-Semitic speech is not criminalized. That's the great ACLU cases of the mid 20th century, sort of established that. No matter how abhorrent your views are, you can say them. That's being thrown out. And, I think it is an interesting question whether anti-Semitism should be allowed. But being against Israel is not
It's
anti-Semitic.
just a country.
Saying that Jews and Israel are the same thing is incredibly anti-Semitic. And that is the IHRA definition that is being incorporated by universities now in law, and specifically by the Trump administration. We got this letter to Columbia specifically saying that we have to formalize, adopt, and promulgate a definition of anti-Semitism. President Trump's executive order 13899 uses the IHRA definition. Anti-Zionist discrimination against Jews in areas unrelated to Israel or Middle East must be addressed. So yeah, it is fundamental. It is an attempt to overthrow the fundamentals of free speech protection in the United States.
Mhm.
And it is effing outrageous. I think we bemoaned it a bit, but I don't think quite grasped how sinister it was in the spring of last year when the Columbia protests became national and international news. My attitude towards the Columbia protests, I live about half an hour walk from the Columbia campus. Since those protests started, the Columbia University has closed its campus, which is annoying. It used to be a lovely campus to walk through.
Mhm.
It has not reopened a year later. At the time, I was like, why are we paying so much attention to this? Like, what's the issue here? Like, what's the like? Obviously, students are going to protest stuff.
Yeah,
Obviously, while they protest stuff, you're going to be able to go up to individuals and hear them say really stupid things because they are teenagers.
but they're also largely ignored.
Yeah, like that's as they should be. Like I was a very conservative, sort of reactionary guy, not even libertarian yet when I was in college campus, and I thought all those protesters were fucking dumbasses or whatever. Like who cares? Whatever. That's just part of life. Like that's just what happens. And it was like it was puzzling to me why we were hearing so much about Columbia and why so many publications were talking about this plague of campus anti-Semitism. It is not anti-Semitic to point out that there is a country carrying out a Holocaust and we'd like it to stop. That is not anti-Semitic. But I think a lot of this full-throated assault on free speech comes from a really growing realization among supporters of Israel in the United States who do tend to be more highly educated and very intelligent people who see themselves as often liberal, progressive people who care about the world. Like, I get the intellectual torment here. I get how difficult this is when you've got a lot of emotional investment in a country like Israel, and it is carrying out crimes that look very similar to the crime that was carried out against your people that supposedly necessitated the creation of Israel. I get how difficult that is, but I do not think that means we should throw out the First Amendment, that we should throw out free speech protections that are central to the United States. And I think the amount of time and effort that was spent on getting university presidents to come in and defend the fact that there were protesters they hadn't arrested on their college campuses. Like that was an extraordinary thing. It wasn't, it was the U.S. Congress, not the Biden administration specifically that made those invitations, but that was a pretty extraordinary display and a disgusting display, I would argue. I think most of the university presidents, actually, I think the MIT president might have done a pretty good job
Okay.
being just sort of shutting everybody down. But like a lot of them just sort of came in and sort of gave woke platitudes and were unwilling to defend free speech on any level.
Yeah.
And I think most of them got fired, pretty deservedly. It's kind of sad that, universities, which have always been a special privileged place and certainly over the past couple decades of educating millennials, the largest generation the United States has ever had, have gotten an extremely larger level of privilege. And the fact that the people chosen as presidents of these campuses were utterly incapable of protecting basic free speech, basic academic freedom was pretty humiliating. But I think they were kind of led in that by the Democratic establishment and Joe Biden himself, who was really eager to talk about, oh, campus anti-Semitism, it's such a terrible problem, not the genocide we were carrying out with Israel in Palestine. And it is interesting to me why.
Has Trump threatened to remove funding from universities that conduct protesting against
Yes,
Israel?
that specifically is what's happening to Columbia. So Columbia itself has been a flashpoint on these issues for a very long time because, and I think it actually, specifically the behavior of the Columbia alumni is really interesting here. Yeah, I think it is actually a specific organization that I saw celebrating Mahmoud Khalil's arrest. This was, I think it was a Columbia Jewish Alumni Association who had been at sort of the forefront of this crusade against campus anti-Semitism because we really don't want to look at what these protesters are telling us is happening and is obviously happening in Israel. And it's sort of the fall of Columbia University as an institution. Columbia is not top tier Ivy League, but it's absolutely like a top 10 country university in the
Yeah,
country.
yeah.
You know, it's not
It
Harvard.
is quite a prestigious one.
It's not Harvard, Princeton, Yale, or Stanford, but it's just right underneath that. And it's New York City's university. So it has, or one of New York City's many universities, but it is the New York City Ivy, beautiful campus in Upper Manhattan, and it has and this is what is actually honestly so disappointing. It is not a new dynamic that Jewish Americans who are sympathetic to Israel are overrepresented in Columbia's alumni. This is the New York Ivy League. It is a very heavily Jewish campus, has been for a century. It's one of the great things about Columbia. And part of that tradition, which I do associate with Jewish Americans, is actually incredible vigor towards free speech. Edward Said is is certainly one of the formative figures of Palestinian resistance as an intellectual, not fighting on the ground, but like he was a known figure. I mean, we would let him on cable TV or on television in the 70s and 80s in the United States. I think he wrote the book Orientalism. He's a Palestinian American, I assume, professor at Columbia University. So that was like the level of dedication that we had from, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, already a largely Jewish American administration of Columbia was like, yeah, this guy is like the intellectual firebrand of all intellectual firebrands for Free Palestine. As a Jewish American, supporter of Israel, I want to employ him
Mhm.
like at my university because that's how highly, and this is something that I associate with the Jewish American tradition, that's how highly I value free interchange. And like, I'm not gonna penalize this guy. I'm not gonna I'm gonna employ this guy and we're gonna argue and he's gonna educate my Jewish children and they're gonna learn how to either argue against him or learn from him. Like that's what I associate with like New York legal Jewish Americans, like I mean, legal in terms of like in the legal
Oh, yeah, yeah,
profession,
yeah.
in the academic
Lawyers and
profession,
that.
like that's what I say. And it's extraordinarily disappointing to see because if like, if the Jewish American folks who ran Columbia University in the 80s and 90s and employed Edward Said got a letter like this from Donald Trump,
Mhm.
they would, Zionist or not, they would have considered that like a call to arms to just go. I mean, these are the folks who were at the forefront of defeating McCarthyism. Like they would have, for their kids and their grandkids to become these like jumped up penny anti-fascists who are encouraging their institution to buckle under to Donald Trump is disgusting to me. And not, no, okay, disgusting overstate. It's just heartbreaking to me. It's just really sad. And I think part of why this week has been so difficult to me is I love the United States. I love the United States intellectual tradition. I love and cherish all the threads that go into that. And Columbia, specifically with its Jewish American underpinnings, is like a part of that. I've worked with this institution to bring about positive free speech results, and to see the alumni and the administrators of this university just bend the knee to Donald effing Trump on this is it's heartbreaking, really.
Where is he at the moment? Do we know? Or
Mahmoud Khalil is now with a growing population of students in the U.S. university system being held not quite incommunicado. He had a moving letter that he put out recently, is being held in an ICE detention facility in Louisiana. It is absolutely.
because he has a green card, isn't that the big thing?
Well, he's got a green card. He's married to I think, 8 months pregnant American wife who is now without her. Now, my actual on Mahmoud Khalil specifically, my expectation is that he's going to be in that ICE detention facility for about 6 months before every judge, no matter who appointed them, smacks down the Trump
Hmm.
administration, up to and including, 7 out of 9 people on the Republican Supreme Court. Because this is
There's no excuse for
it,
it.
it's my legal background, as much as it is my liberalism or leftism or whatnot that makes me as disgusted as I am right
Do you
now.
think this move is thought out? Is the idea that if you're not a born American and you have strong views against Israel, it's time to leave? Or is it just a bit ham fisted?
I mean, it's incredibly ham-fisted. There's no like the justification they use is some nonsense from the 1950s. The fact that they have multiple times come out and said he has committed no crime, is pretty extraordinary, and it's a layup on the First Amendment, in every sense. Their attempts to affiliate him with terrorism or Hamas have been largely farcical. It's almost with Mahmoud Khalil. It's almost as if they picked the perfect and perhaps that's how confident they are in their fascist reordering of the United
Or do
States.
they see if they can get him, they could get
Yeah, if
anybody?
they could get him, they could get anybody. I mean, Khalil's got plenty of statements to major news organizations in the United States because he was a spokesman for this movement, condemning anti-Semitism and like, yeah, I mean, this is like the ideal test case for this. There's a lot of aspects about this that are really, really disturbing, but I think just to dial back for a moment, just it's interesting. Why would Israel superfans decide to do this? And I think it's fundamentally it's about a lot of things changing. There's a lot of arguments that used to be made for Israel's behavior that simply don't work anymore. What's kind of interesting to me is that the United States public used to be a lot more sympathetic to this sort of thing. In the 1980s, we look back on it now, it's like, who could have possibly supported apartheid South Africa? Well, in the 1980s, like the Reagan administration,
Yeah.
like Republicans, like you can find, like, I think we talked about this book that was really this book by a conservative guy who came to really hate the Bush administration and what he was doing. We talked about this a couple episodes back, and it's fascinating. There's one sentence in there from one of his essays from the 1990s, and you can just see, like, wait a second, was that an excuse for defending South Africa? And this is a guy who ended his life being as rabidly anti-imperialist as you can imagine. But before the post-Cold War era turned him in that direction, like he was a 1980s Republican. So like maybe, all this rabble rousing around South Africa just doesn't make sense. Da, 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 da. But the Vietnam War fundamentally was an imperialist war. It was continuing the conflict. It's certainly sold in different ways now, but most people watching the Vietnam War in the 1960s and the 70s in the United States knew that this was just a continuation of the French war to repress the Vietnamese people. So the very straightforwardly colonial, imperial, exterminate the brutes, brown people mean less than white people thing that Israel is selling wasn't that hard to sell in, the United States that was, having trouble getting rid of segregation in the 1960s, the 1970s. Like it wasn't like that. It wasn't that crazy. It was only by the 1990s that you had sort of like the majority of the United States who might have difficulty with that sort of thing. And of course, it was in the mid 90s where the US tolerance for this kind of brutal empire type stuff diminished that we got the peace process. And for the aughts, for the 90s, the peace process, which actually was kind of proceeding during the 1990s, became the justification for what Israel was doing. And then in 2001, Israel got a great sort of carte blanche, sort of a free pass, because any kind of Palestinian resistance could be portrayed as the same thing as the Saudi terrorists who did 9/11. But that started to fade, and that's sort of how we got to what we were talking about in the teens with this campaign against BDS. And frankly, the complete security that Israel has now compared to earlier decades makes it a lot harder to justify what Israel is doing, especially because what Israel is doing right now is so much worse than what it was doing in earlier decades, when it was actually in some kind of legitimate danger and had to make the case for itself within the region and to the United
When
States.
do you think it was completely out of that danger, that it made it very hard to justify it?
Oh, the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War. And that's also what fed into why there was a peace process in the 1990s. During the 1980s, well, so during the Cold War, I actually did this at some point. I can't remember where I put it, but I made a list, and helping the Israelis oppress the Palestinians does not make the top 10 of the nastiest things the United States did during the Cold
Yeah.
War. It absolutely does
Oh, yeah,
not.
yeah, yeah.
But by the 1990s, it was becoming more and more of an outlier as the United States allowed peace to come to Central America, allowed our nastiest dictators in Africa and Asia to fall. It sort of became worse and worse, and now it's one of the worst things we do.
But does this not show just how good Israel is at ensuring that America stays an ally? Because we've seen recently where America just goes, Ukraine, we're fed up with you, can't be bothered with that. Canada, we're going to take over you. Like, is there something special, or like credit has to be given that Israel is able to guarantee America will be like the eternal
Well,
ally that always protects it?
there's a lot of natural affinity. Would have been a lot closer, or could have been different.
Yeah, less than 2%.
Yeah, without the Democratic Party being saddled with this genocide that that Netanyahu basically stopped the second Donald Trump became president, and is now, of course,
Well,
restarting.
the Democrats still don't acknowledge that.
Yeah, of course. No, it's the groups or something. It's we cared too much about trans people and environmentalists. Yeah.
Sorry, just one thing that really annoys me is that one of the first ones they were attacking was black men, and when you look at the stats, the black men were the second most likely to vote for the
Oh,
Democrats,
sure. Yeah.
only followed by black women, and have been one of the most like loyal to the Democrats throughout history. But the second they don't win, they turn on them. It just sickens me.
Yeah. So they went from like 95% to 92%, and it's like,
Yeah, something like
yeah,
that.
it's anyway, that is a different atrocity I don't really want to discuss. But I think so we should turn to what Trump has been doing this week, and the extraordinary just that extraordinary fact that he is carrying out an assault against college campuses that is coordinated with Israel's restarted genocide and coordinated with that assault on Yemen. It is extraordinary. There was the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, March 8th, 2025, by ICE, which is also kind of gross. This is meant to be sort of a border protection institution. It is under the Department of Homeland Security. We saw this dynamic under the first Trump administration. The Department of Homeland Security was created under the Bush administration as a response to 9/11. And it's just fundamentally, it's like if you set out to create an institution to kill the American Republic, the Department of Homeland Security is what you would put together. So before 9/11, the United States had a broad array, the United States federal government had a broad array of a surprising number, actually, of military, paramilitary, investigatory, policing forces across the United States. All of these, like the FBI, or I don't know, I think the FBI is still under the Department of Justice, but a variety of these institutions, I think alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, all had their own little forces and customs and border protection and ICE, which might have been something different before Department of Homeland Security. But they all had their particularities, they all had their legal variety, tied in red tape in a variety of ways, to make it harder for the federal government to impinge on the rights of individuals and the states to carry out their own, you know,
So were they kind of messy, but messy in a good way?
intentionally messy. Over the course of the 20th century, the federal government and Congress agreed that, yeah, maybe they should have a police force. Maybe the FBI should exist. Maybe we need another, a little more money for the Coast Guard or whatnot. It was only under 9/11 that all of these institutions got sucked up to be under one department with broader capacity to gather intelligence. It's basically like the embryo. I'm not saying this is how Bush used it. I'm not saying this is how Obama used it. I'm saying it's definitely how Trump used it by 2020, and it's definitely how he's using it now as sort of the beginning of the American Gestapo.
Oh,
So it was
wow.
just
Quite a
the
statement.
legal groundwork was laid. And at the time, everyone was like, this is a really bad idea. We shouldn't give this much power to like the federal government for domestic policing, and essentially the monopoly of violence is sort of going from the states where we wanted it to be to up to the federal government. And with all the money and intelligence resources they can bring to bear, this is a bad idea. But under Bush and Obama, it sort of functioned. It didn't function well, but it functioned. Um, in response to the protests of 2020, Trump started using DHS. There's really extraordinary figures, the first time in American history that I can think of masked
Hmm.
paramilitary federal government folks answering to the president in Washington, D.C. Now, it was difficult for him to do this because there's actually still under DHS, this is not enough people to police a nationwide protest movement. But he was using, I mean, it was very clearly like, oh, this gets.
Are these ones that are grabbing random American civilians and putting them in vans for a bit and stuff like
Yes,
that?
yes, that those were mostly DHS folks. So this was, Bush's Gestapo and embryo started having some applications in the fourth year of Donald Trump's presidency. It
Yeah.
seems that Trump and the people around him have come prepared to start using it in that respect right now. So it's nominally got something to do with the Department of State. Maybe they just roped in Rubio because they like humiliating him. I don't know. But fundamentally, you've got the Department of Homeland Security with ICE agents running around college campuses, arresting foreign students at a variety of levels of legal whether it's visas or green card, legal residency. They haven't yet gotten graduated to arresting people like me for dissenting on the topic of Israel, but that's just a matter of time.
Could you see the likes of your equivalent in a red state getting snapped up first?
I don't honestly see that during the Trump administration, but like this is, the most paranoid civil libertarians who were probably working at Columbia during the Bush administration, whose like worst case scenarios for what the Department of Homeland Security would end up doing as sort of a Gestapo or Praetorian Guard for the president started to be realized in 2020. Now in 2024, and I assume they will mostly be victimizing brown people, foreign nationals or whatnot over the course of, this reactionary presidential administration. But 10 years from now, who knows? Who knows? And, it won't necessarily be a Republican administration. Who knows what the Democrats will look like in 10 years?
Could you see them lurching more to the right to get votes?
It is very hard for me to predict, but it's so it's funny. So Mahmoud Khalil specifically, nothing funny about it. It's horrific, but I still do think that the courts are going to probably release him. But of course, the chilling effect has been made. Colombia didn't just go after Khalil. Colombia has expelled retroactively in some cases, stripped people of their diplomas for participating in a protest movement last year. That was some of the other news that Colombia has rolled out here. It's really just an extraordinary humiliation of this
Are
institution.
there any universities that have gone completely, would make what Colombia's done look like a very insignificant thing? Like, are there ones that are completely, fully, you can't say anything wrong against Israel?
No, that's the crazy
Okay.
thing, Rory, is like that's not how universities are supposed to be organized. Like
Yeah.
certainly there's very right-wing institutions where I somehow doubt there was a Palestinian encampment at like his Hillsdale or Oral Roberts University. There's a wide variety of universities and approaches, and I think there are largely Jewish universities in the United States. There are but like no so essentially so on March 8th, Trump's Gestapo arrested Mahmoud Khalil, and then on March 13th he sent this extraordinary letter threatening to strip Columbia University of $400 million of federal funding. It is kind of interesting though that a private university gets $400 million in federal
True.
funding. I do think that can actually be explained largely by science. I mean, Columbia has a number of medical research hospitals, universities, and so like it's like it is a lot of money,
Yeah.
which perhaps indicates. But the thing is, again, if the alumni and the administration of Columbia were what they were 20 years ago, they would tell Donald Trump to go F themselves. But because so many of, again, like the natural defenders of free speech and legal rights of minorities in this country, like the sort of broadly, not exclusively, but broadly sort of Jewish American people who run Columbia University or at least fund Columbia University, if they decided to knuckle under to this obscene list of requirements from the Trump administration, enforce existing disciplinary policies with underlined meaningful discipline means expulsion or multi-year suspension. Columbia did that this week. Primacy of the president in disciplinary matters, basically stripping the regular, basically allowing the president to make undemocratic, very quick decisions in response to donors and the president. Time, place, and manner rules, essentially limiting protests. Mask bans to make it easier to identify and
Yeah.
persecute protesters. Deliver a plan to hold all student groups accountable, essentially to go after many organizations, many Jewish organizations that are
Hmm.
pro-Palestine. Formalize, adopt, and promulgate a definition of anti-Semitism, specifically shouting out that IHRA thing. Empower internal law enforcement, essentially allowing Columbia security to be more brutal. Uh, Putting the Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies Department into academic receivership, which they don't put a lot of detail into, but essentially saying, we're going to fire anybody we want, and deliver a plan for comprehensive admissions reform. Basically,
Wow.
stop letting in these brown people who might complain about genocide. And
Hmm.
this list of demands, any self-respecting institution of my youth that cared about free speech, honest inquiry, would have delighted in telling such a president to go F themselves. But because the administrators of Columbia are more interested in, or alumni of Columbia are more interested in protecting genocide than protecting their dignity as an Ivy League institution, it appears they're knuckling under, which is pretty horrifying. I think I've said exactly that more or less twice during this episode, and I
Yeah.
think it's worth saying because it's horrifying. To go in another more horrifying direction, which I think would be a good
Uh-oh.
way to close this. I don't want to imply that I'm somehow like picking on Republicans here. The Biden administration really laid the groundwork for this. Horrible things happen. U.S. governments have always done horrible things. I think it was the American Prestige podcast was really very careful to point out, like, hey, Mahmoud Khalil is absolutely not the first person arrested or persecuted for their views in the United States. He's just, the most prominent one recently. We haven't seen this, for quite some time with this egregiousness, but, this happens in U.S. history all the time. But I do believe that it is possible for presidents to do really outsized evil things that aren't followed up by anything. Like nothing, it doesn't immediately get much worse. But all of these horrible things that happen are pieces of a toolbox that can be picked up by later generations. And it is a very different situation in some respects, but it is both sort of tangentially related to the war on terror more broadly. But when reading about the story of Mahmoud Khalil, who is a political prisoner, I couldn't help but think of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a U.S. citizen who was murdered by the Obama administration.
The death of Awlaki is a major blow to al-Qaeda's most active operational affiliate. Awlaki was the leader of external operations for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In that role, he took the lead in planning and directing efforts to murder innocent Americans.
And when that happened, I was incredibly disturbed. This is a guy who actually after 9/11 was like sort of a all about peace and love, and was actually on a lot of TV shows in the U.S., but then eventually went to Yemen and was radicalized by Abu Ghraib and the Iraq invasions, then the other thing, and started becoming much more critical of the United States. So it's one thing if the U.S. kills a U.S. citizen in a firefight, which I'm sure happened in Afghanistan or Iraq or what have you. But no, the Obama administration created, and this is, I think, the affinity between what Trump is doing and what the Obama administration did with Mahmoud Khalil and Anwar al-Awlaki, is that the Obama administration created a detailed, like extensive legal justification for murdering an American citizen who wasn't actually physically fighting against. Well, I mean that's two podcast episodes in and of itself. The Obama administration claimed he had direct links to Al-Qaeda that it's not clear he ever really had. He was absolutely preaching against the United States. He was preaching violence against the United States from Yemen. The Obama administration put together this sort of mythology that somehow defeating him was key, killing him was key to the battle against Al-Qaeda, which of course proved to be nonsense. Regardless, whether he was, doing Al-Qaeda ideological work or not, it is an obscenity that the Obama administration chose to murder this U.S. citizen and went to great efforts and like multiple bombing runs to just kill a guy for what he was saying. That's appalling. And you know what? That was never really picked up again. But they created a legal architecture that absolutely the Trump administration could pick up again, or the Vance administration, or the Newsom administration, or some administration down the line could pick up again. And I think that, like the al-Awlaki thing, this is incredibly sinister, evil thing that was done by a Democratic administration, this now broader attempt than just Mahmoud Khalil to make it illegal for students in the United States to speak their mind is creating a whole new architecture. Now, the Trump administration is much dumber, and I think that this is unlikely to survive judicial precedent. But then the Trump administration will come back with something else on a different level, and they're just adding to the architecture of the eventual collapse of the U.S. Republic. And I don't like it, Rory. I don't like it.
Well, it all does sound very scary, but maybe we'll do an update in 6 months or so and see if things have gotten as bad as you're worried they will get.
Yeah.
But yes, maybe we'll have a Canada episode later on that might be a bit
little cheerier, maybe. Yeah. Anyway.
They do have an election coming up.
Thanks for coming with me on this journey, Rory, and everybody else. I hope I didn't come across as too heated, but I'm pretty heated on this one.
Yeah, well, let's hope you're not grabbed by the mass man anytime soon.
That would be that. I don't expect that, in the next 20 years. If I'm still doing this 20 years from now, I'd get more worried about that.
Okay. Well, on that cheery note, we'll catch you next time.
All right. Thanks.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.